It was a dark, rainy evening in London, the kind where the streets seem to melt into the mist, and every shadow holds a secret. I had just returned from a rather tedious dinner when a knock came at the door of our Baker Street apartment. A most unusual knock, fast, urgent, as if the very wind itself were desperate to be heard. I opened it to find a man standing on the threshold, drenched to the bone, his face pale with fear, and his eyes wide with some dreadful knowledge. Before I could speak, he simply handed me a letter, sealed in black wax, the faint scent of something unfamiliar clinging to the envelope. The man's hands trembled as he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "You must stop him, Mr. Holmes, before it's too late, before he strikes again." I had no idea then that this small, cryptic visit would lead us into the heart of a mystery, unlike any I had encountered before. A web of deceit, danger, and a criminal mastermind who seemed always a step ahead. And yet, as always, the game was afoot. Chapter 1. The Moscow Train. Mystery. It was a bitterly cold winter afternoon when Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson found themselves seated in a modestly heated compartment aboard the Trans-Siberian Express, the train that would carry them from Moscow to the far reaches of the Russian countryside. Holmes, as usual, was lost in thought, his long fingers tapping rhythmically against the window, tracing the invisible paths of his observations. Dr. Watson, ever the companion, sat quietly opposite him, his eyes flicking from his medical journal to the frosty landscape outside. "It seems like a simple journey, Watson," Holmes said abruptly, breaking the silence. "But we are here for a reason, aren't we?" Watson, puzzled, looked up from his journal. "What do you mean, Holmes?" "I thought we were merely accompanying this letter of introduction to Count Ivanovich in Siberia." Holmes smiled faintly, his piercing gaze narrowing as he peered through the small train window. "A journey of such trivialities never holds interest for me, Watson. It is the unexpected that beckons me, the strange anomaly that defies logic." Watson leaned back, perplexed. "You believe something will happen?" Holmes gave him a look that was both knowing and distant. "Something always happens, Watson. It's only a matter of when and how." It was then that the doors to their compartment opened and a young woman, no older than 25, stepped inside. She was tall, with raven black hair that seemed to shimmer even in the dim light of the train. Her eyes were large and dark, carrying an air of mystery that immediately caught Holmes's attention. She wore an elegant fur coat, the kind only the wealthy could afford, but there was something unmistakably anxious about her. She gave them both a hesitant smile, her lips trembling slightly. "Excuse me, gentlemen," she began, her voice soft yet filled with urgency. "I'm afraid I need your help." Holmes's eyes gleamed with intrigue as he gestured for her to sit. "Please, Miss Lena Dabrowski," she replied, her hands tightly clutching a small leather handbag. I've been followed." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Watson raised an eyebrow, glancing at Holmes, who motioned for the young woman to continue. "I know this will sound unbelievable," Lena continued, her voice shaky, "but I have reason to believe someone is watching me." She paused, her eyes darting to the door, then to the small window beside it. "I can't explain why, but there is a man aboard this train. I think he's been following me for days. Ever since I left St. Petersburg, he's been shadowing me, always just out of sight." Holmes was utterly still, his eyes never leaving her face. "You say you've been followed," he repeated softly. "By whom?" "I don't know." She hesitated, then looked down at her hands. but I'm certain. And now I fear for my life. He's getting closer. Watson leaned forward. Did you know this man? Have you seen him before? Lena shook her head, her fingers trembling as she placed the bag on her lap. No, but I think he's after something in my possession. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Something? You must be more specific, Miss Dubrovsky. She opened her bag, her movements swift yet nervous. She withdrew a small, intricately carved wooden box, its surface polished to a high sheen. It looked like something ancient, a family heirloom perhaps. She held it close, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. This box, she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. It was given to me by my late father. He was a man of secrets, Mr. Holmes. He often spoke of this box, of its contents. I don't know what's inside, but it's been passed down through generations in my family. I don't want anyone to take it. Holmes's eyes gleamed with a mix of curiosity and calculation. And you believe this man wants the box? Lena nodded, her eyes wide with fear. Yes, he has tried to steal it from me twice now. Once in St. Petersburg, and then again as I boarded this train. He was waiting for me at the station. I barely escaped with my life. Holmes stood abruptly, his sharp gaze scanning the compartment, then the corridor outside. Tell me, Miss Dubrovsky, he said, turning back to her. How long have you been traveling aboard this train? For 4 days now. I'm traveling to Vladivostok where I'm meeting someone. And no one else aboard the train seems suspicious? Holmes asked, pacing slowly around the compartment, his mind already working at full speed. Lena shook her head again. I haven't seen anyone who stands out, but I can feel him, Mr. Holmes, watching me. Holmes turned sharply, fixing his gaze on her. You've done well to come to me. We will get to the bottom of this, Miss Dubrovsky. Watson looked at Holmes, concern creeping into his expression. But Holmes, we are in the middle of a train journey. What can we possibly do? Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened the compartment door and stepped into the narrow hallway of the train, followed closely by Watson and the young woman. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels against the tracks was a constant backdrop, and the cold wind from outside crept through the thin walls of the car. Holmes's sharp eyes scanned every passenger, every face in the hallway, and then, without warning, he turned to Lena. Stay close to us, he instructed. Do not leave this compartment until we know more. The young woman nodded, clinging to the box as if it were her lifeline. Holmes turned to Watson, his mind already racing ahead. We are dealing with someone who has been watching her for days, he muttered, his voice cold. This is no simple matter. We must identify the man following her before it is too late. The game was afoot. Chapter 2. Shadows on the train. The train rumbled on through the Russian countryside, the cold wind outside howling as the snowstorm intensified. Inside the compartment, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Lena Dubrovsky sat on the edge of her seat, clutching the small wooden box to her chest, as if it were her only protection against the growing unease. Dr. Watson, ever the concerned companion, glanced over at her, his brow furrowed in worry. Holmes, however, was already deep in thought, his eyes scanning the faces of the other passengers in the compartment. He had yet to speak, and the silence only added to the tension in the air. Watson couldn't help but feel uneasy. It wasn't like Holmes would be so still for long. His mind was always worrying, always 10 steps ahead of everyone else. But in this moment, he appeared to be in a state of deep concentration, observing everything around him with the precision of a hawk. Finally, Holmes spoke, breaking the silence in his usual calm, measured tone. "Watson, I need you to observe the passengers more closely." He didn't look at his companion, but instead continued to study the outside world through the compartment's frosted window. "We are not alone on this train, and the man Miss Dabrowski fears may very well be among us." Watson blinked, trying to process his words. "You think he's already on the train?" Holmes nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. "It's the only logical explanation. He knows where she is, and he's not waiting for the right moment to strike. He's been patient, biding his time. It's a rare criminal who doesn't make a move until they are certain their victim is vulnerable." Lena's eyes darted nervously toward the door. "But how can you be sure? Could he not be outside the train, waiting for me at the next station?" Holmes turned his piercing gaze toward her, his expression unreadable. "If he were outside, Miss Dabrowski, he would have made his move long before now. He's already aboard, and it's only a matter of time before he acts." Watson leaned forward in his seat. "But how do we find him, Holmes? We can't just start accusing people." Holmes gave a small, enigmatic smile. "Ah, but we can, Watson. We can start by eliminating the most obvious suspects." His voice dropped slightly as he turned to Lena. "Tell me, Miss Dabrowski, do you have any reason to suspect any of the passengers? Have you seen anyone who seems out of place?" Lena hesitated, her gaze flicking around the compartment, as if searching for something or someone she could identify. I don't know. There's nothing specific, but I've had the strangest feeling ever since I boarded. The man I saw at the station in St. Petersburg was tall, dark-haired, and always seemed to be in the background. He never approached me directly, but his presence was unnerving." Holmes's eyes gleamed as he stood up abruptly. "Then we have our first lead. Someone who is always in the background, never directly involved. A ghost, if you will. A predator who waits in the shadows." He strode toward the door of the compartment, his sharp gaze catching every detail along the way. "We must start with the passengers in this car. I will speak with them individually, and while I do, I suggest you remain here, Miss Dabrowski. We will take every precaution." Lena nodded, looking both relieved and nervous as she settled back into her seat. Holmes closed the door behind him with a soft click, and Watson followed him into the narrow hallway. The train seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, the soft hum of its wheels against the track, the only sound breaking the otherwise eerie silence. Holmes approached the first passenger, an elderly man who appeared to be dozing in his seat. The man's clothes were well kept, and he held a silver pocket watch that seemed out of place for a man of his age. His eyes flickered open as Holmes stood in front of him. "Excuse me, sir," Holmes began, his voice smooth and polite. "I wonder if you might help me with something. I'm investigating a rather delicate matter, and I was hoping to ask you a few questions." The man blinked, his gaze unfocused at first. "Questions? What kind of questions?" "Nothing to worry about," Holmes replied, his eyes scanning the man's face for any sign of guilt or discomfort. "I'm simply making inquiries about the passengers aboard this train. You see, there have been some strange occurrences, and I'm trying to piece together the details." The elderly man straightened in his seat, looking slightly more alert now. "Strange occurrences?" His voice cracked slightly. "I haven't noticed anything unusual, but then again, I haven't been paying much attention." Holmes studied him for a moment, his sharp gaze not missing the slight tremor in the man's hand as he adjusted his pocket watch. "You've been traveling alone then? No one else accompanying you?" The man hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding. Just me. I've been on this train for a few days now. I like the quiet, you see." Holmes smiled faintly. "Thank you, sir. That will be all." He moved on, but not before noticing the old man's eyes flicker toward the compartment where Lena sat, then quickly avert. Watson, standing just behind Holmes, leaned in. "Holmes, did you notice that?" His eyes darted toward Miss Dabrowski when you mentioned strange occurrences. Holmes's lips curled into a knowing smile. "Indeed, Watson. It was subtle, but it was there. A man who has nothing to hide would have no reason to be so cautious." Holmes continued his investigation, speaking with several other passengers. A well-dressed woman who seemed more interested in her mirror than the conversation, a nervous-looking young man with a quick, darting gaze, and a businessman who appeared uninterested in anything beyond his ledger. Each of them provided little more than surface-level answers, though none of them seemed completely at ease under Holmes's scrutiny. After what felt like hours of questioning, Holmes returned to the compartment where Lena waited, her face still pale, but her posture more composed than before. He closed the door behind him and leaned against the wall, his fingers steepled in thought. "Well, Watson," Holmes said, his voice calm but intense. "We've gathered some interesting pieces of the puzzle, but the true picture remains elusive." Watson raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" The elderly man. "There's something about him, Watson. His nervousness, his quick glances. It's too much of a coincidence that he should be traveling alone, looking so out of place." Holmes paused for a moment, his gaze shifting toward Lena. "And then there is Miss Dabrowski herself. There's more to this box than she's telling us. Why would anyone go to such lengths to follow her for something so ordinary?" Lena looked up, her eyes filled with both fear and curiosity. "What do you think is going on, mister?" "Holmes?" Holmes stood, his expression as unreadable as ever. "I think we've only scratched the surface, Miss Dabrowski. But rest assured the truth is always closer than it seems." And as the train continued its relentless journey through the snowstorm, Holmes knew that the mystery was far from over. It had only just begun. Chapter 3. The Crime Scene. The evening was colder than usual as Holmes and I ventured into the heart of the city, where the fog seemed thicker than ever, creeping into every corner and shrouding the streets in mystery. The knock at our door earlier that day had been unsettling, but it was the call to action that we had been waiting for. The man who had arrived with a letter had led us to a large, imposing mansion in one of the more affluent areas of London. Its towering silhouette loomed ominously in the fading light. The windows, dark and shuttered, offered no glimpse of what lay within. Yet the air surrounding the house seemed thick with foreboding, the shadows lingering just a bit longer than they should. As we were ushered inside by a nervy but dignified butler, I could sense that the house itself was hiding something. Perhaps a long-kept secret, buried beneath layers of history, wealth, and silence. Holmes, as ever, was more concerned with the practicalities of the case. His sharp eyes scanned every inch of the lavishly decorated hallways, noting details that most would overlook. We were led into a sitting room, its ornate furniture barely touched by the guests that must have once filled it. But it was the body, lying at the center of the room, that drew our attention. It had been hastily concealed behind a velvet chair, its blood seeping into the fine carpet beneath. The victim was a man, middle-aged, dressed in a formal suit. His face was pale, his mouth slightly open, frozen in a silent scream of horror. A large, decorative dagger was embedded in his chest. Holmes stood over the body, his eyes moving over every detail, his keen mind already piecing together fragments of the scene. The butler hovered nearby, wringing his hands, his nervous energy filling the room. "What happened here?" Holmes asked, his voice calm, but his gaze piercing as he looked at the butler. The butler seemed to flinch at the question, then quickly looked away as though the answer was something he feared to say. I'm not sure, sir," he stammered. "I found him like this just moments ago. The family—" He paused, his throat tightening as he looked nervously toward the hallway. "They've been away for some time, you see. The staff, we're not accustomed to this sort of thing." Holmes stepped closer to the body, kneeling by the victim. He inspected the bloodstains carefully, his fingers almost brushing the stained carpet. His eyes narrowed. "Whoever did this was not hasty," Holmes remarked. "There's precision in the placement of the blade. Whoever this is, they knew what they were doing, and they wanted to send a message." I glanced at the dagger, its ornate handle glinting in the low light of the room. It was a family heirloom, that much was clear. The design was intricate, no ordinary weapon, but something personal, something meant to make a statement. The blood on the blade had yet to dry completely, indicating that the victim had only just fallen. "What's the connection to the family?" I asked, wondering if this murder was part of a greater plot. Holmes rose and turned back to the butler. "I trust you're aware of any enemies the family may have had?" The butler's eyes darted nervously. I can't speak for them, but this house has seen its share of trouble. There have been rumors, whispers about hidden debts, about dealings that shouldn't have been made, but nothing like this." I frowned, but Holmes was already examining the room again, his eyes sharp as he pieced together the facts. He motioned toward a small table near the fireplace, where an open letter sat. The ink was fresh, and the handwriting elegant but rushed. "What is this?" Holmes muttered, picking it up and quickly scanning its contents. A threat, a warning. The letter was brief but chilling. It read, "The time for secrets is over. He should have listened. The price for betrayal has been paid. You are next. The bloodline ends here." Lena's name wasn't mentioned, but the implications were clear. This was no random crime. The victim had been involved in something that had led to his death, and someone was determined to make sure that their message was loud and clear. Holmes turned to the butler once more. "Did anyone in the household receive such letters before?" The butler swallowed hard, his face going pale. There was talk of it, sir, but I thought it was just rumors." Nothing more. Holmes's sharp eyes seemed to pierce through the butler, and for a brief moment I saw a flicker of something. Guilt, fear. But the butler quickly averted his gaze, his hands shaking more noticeably. "Rumors can be dangerous," Holmes said softly, "and secrets can be deadly." As Holmes rose, the air in the room seemed to grow colder. The body, the letter, the cryptic message, everything pointed to one thing. This wasn't just a random act of violence. This was carefully orchestrated, a piece in a much larger puzzle. "We need to move quickly," Holmes said, his voice firm as he turned toward the door. "Someone wanted to make an example out of this man, and they'll want to finish what they started." Chapter 4. The Unseen Hand. The train sped through the frozen wilderness, its rhythmic clatter a constant companion to the tense silence that hung in the air. Holmes had spent hours meticulously observing the passengers, piecing together fragments of information, but the pieces of the puzzle were still scattered, just out of reach. Lena Dobrovsky, once anxious, had become more guarded with every passing hour. Her grip on the mysterious wooden box had tightened, and Holmes could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She was on the edge of breaking down, and yet she refused to share more than she already had. She was protecting something, or perhaps someone. Holmes had done his best to reassure her, but the truth was, even he felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. In the compartment, the dim light flickered as the train hit a patch of rough track. Holmes was sitting with his fingers steepled, deep in thought, when Dr. Watson, ever observant, broke the silence. "Holmes, I've been thinking," Watson began, his voice quiet. "Do you believe Lena knows more than she's letting on? Something about that box, perhaps? She's withholding something important." Holmes glanced up at his companion, his eyes, sharp and calculating, fixed on Watson with a piercing intensity. "Yes, Watson, I do. But there is something more at play here. Miss Dobrovsky isn't just scared of a man following her, she's terrified of something much deeper. That box, whatever is inside it, has become the focal point of her fear." Watson leaned back, rubbing his chin. "But what could be so important about a box? It doesn't make sense." Holmes stood abruptly, his expression a mixture of frustration and focus. "It doesn't make sense, Watson. That's the very reason why it's critical. Nothing about this situation adds up. Lena has been targeted, but she hasn't been entirely forthcoming. We need to push her. Gently, of course, but we need the truth." Just as Holmes spoke, the compartment door opened, and Lena stood there, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't say a word, she didn't need to. The expression on her face spoke volumes. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I think I've seen him." Holmes was on his feet in an instant, his eyes narrowing. "Who, Miss Dobrovsky? The man you've been afraid of?" Lena nodded, her hands trembling. "Yes, I saw him outside the window just now, standing at the end of the corridor watching me." Holmes and Watson exchanged a quick glance. It was time to act. Without another word, Holmes strode toward the door, opening it just enough to peer into the corridor. The narrow hallway was eerily quiet, bathed in dim light from the overhead bulbs. Nothing. No one. He stepped into the hallway, his gaze sweeping from one end to the other. Watson followed close behind, his hand instinctively resting on his medical bag. They moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the carpet beneath them. Holmes moved quickly, his mind already racing through the possibilities. The man Lena had seen was likely still on board, but where? The train was a confined space, and yet Holmes felt a creeping sense of unease. There was something wrong, something just out of reach. As they neared the end of the car, Holmes's eyes caught a faint movement at the far end of the corridor. A shadow darted into another compartment. Without hesitation, Holmes broke into a quick walk, heading toward the door that had just been opened. "Stay close, Watson," Holmes murmured under his breath. "I have a feeling we are very close to uncovering the truth." They reached the compartment just as the door clicked shut, the sound sharp in the otherwise silent train. Holmes knocked quickly, the sharp rattle of his knuckles against the wood filling the space. "Open the door," he commanded, "in the name of the law." A brief silence followed. Holmes's gaze never wavered, his hand resting on the door handle. The tension was palpable. Inside, Holmes could hear soft shuffling, the unmistakable sound of someone moving. Finally, the door creaked open, revealing a tall man with a cold expression. He was dressed in a dark, well-tailored suit, his eyes hidden behind a pair of thick glasses. Holmes wasted no time. "I am investigating a matter of great importance," he said, his tone sharp. "I need to ask you a few questions." The man didn't flinch. Instead, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Of course, Mr. Holmes," he said, smoothly, stepping aside to allow them entry. Holmes entered first, his eyes scanning the compartment. It was a simple one, nothing extraordinary. A small desk, a briefcase resting on a chair, and a book open on the table. The man seemed almost too calm, too composed. Watson followed closely behind, his senses on edge. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about this man. Holmes turned to face the man, his gaze never leaving him. "I understand you've been traveling on this train for a few days now. Perhaps you can tell me your business." The man smiled faintly, his eyes glinting behind his glasses. "I am a businessman, Mr. Holmes. I am traveling to Vladivostok on some personal matters." Holmes didn't believe him. "Personal matters?" he repeated, his voice cutting through the air. "You're here on more than just business. We both know that. Now, I suggest you tell me what you're really doing here." The man's smile faltered for just a second, but it was enough. Holmes had seen it. "I'm afraid you've mistaken me for someone else," the man said, his voice losing some of its composure. "I'm just a traveler, like the others." Before he could finish, Holmes reached forward, snatching the book from the desk. It was open to a page filled with strange symbols. Symbols that clearly had no connection to anything ordinary. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "This is no ordinary book, is it?" He turned the page with deliberate slowness, studying the symbols with intense focus. "Tell me, who is it you're really working for?" The man's face drained of color. His jaw clenched, but it was too late. Holmes had already caught the smallest tremor in his hands. An admission of guilt, even if he refused to speak it. "You're the one who's been following Miss Dabrowski," Holmes said calmly. "You've been after that box. And now I believe I know why." The man took a step back, his face suddenly hard. "You don't know what you're getting into, Holmes." His voice was low, dangerous. "You can't protect her." Holmes stood tall, unfazed. "We'll see about that." With a swift motion, Holmes gestured for Watson to move toward the door. "Take him into custody," he said. "It's time for the truth to come to light." The mystery was unraveling, and for the first time, Holmes felt that he was finally in control. But as they moved to restrain the man, the real question remained. What exactly was inside that box? And how far would these shadowy figures go to possess it? Chapter 5. The Secrets Unveiled. The train had slowed, its wheels grinding against the tracks as it began to pull into a small station nestled deep in the Russian wilderness. The snowstorm outside had intensified, casting an almost otherworldly glow over the landscape. Inside the compartment, however, the atmosphere was anything but tranquil. Holmes, Watson, and the captured man, who now sat in a corner of the compartment bound and gagged, were preparing for what they knew was a critical moment. Lena Dabrowski, who had been silently observing the proceedings, was clearly shaken but trying to hold herself together. She had not spoken much since the confrontation with the mysterious man, but her eyes were wide with the weight of what had just occurred. She had not expected her fears to manifest in the way they had, nor did she fully understand the extent of the danger she was in. Holmes, standing near the window, gazed out at the approaching station. His sharp mind was already working, running through all the pieces of the puzzle, all the angles. But he had yet to fully connect everything. There were still so many questions, so many loose ends. "Mr. Holmes," Lena said softly, her voice trembling. "What happens now? Who is he? And what do you think is inside the box?" Holmes turned his piercing gaze toward her, his expression as unreadable as ever. "The man you saw on the train is not merely a passenger, Miss Dubrovsky. He is a hired agent, part of a much larger scheme, and he's been after that box for far longer than you could imagine." Lena's eyes widened. "A scheme? But why? Why me?" Holmes's brow furrowed. "You are caught in the middle of something far more intricate than a simple robbery. That box, Miss Dubrovsky, is not just a family heirloom. It contains something much more valuable, something that could change the balance of power for many people. Your father, as I now understand it, was involved in something far beyond his station, and he entrusted you with this box as a safeguard." Lena looked down at the box in her hands, her grip tightening. "But I don't understand. What is inside it?" Holmes stepped forward, the tension in the air palpable. "The contents of the box are what I need to confirm, but I can tell you this. It is of immense historical importance. Your father's involvement in Russian espionage was not an accident. He had enemies, powerful ones, and the box you carry is the key to a web of secrets. Secrets that must never be uncovered." Watson, who had been listening intently, exchanged a glance with Holmes. "You mean this man," he said, nodding toward the bound figure in the corner, "was after more than just money?" "He was after information, information that could tip the balance of power." Holmes nodded. "Exactly, Watson. This is no ordinary theft. Whoever controls that box controls the knowledge within it, and it seems that there are many who would stop at nothing to get their hands on it." The man, who had been sitting in silence since his capture, suddenly stirred. His eyes, cold and calculating, met Holmes's with a chilling intensity. He had been listening to their conversation, and now, as the train rolled to a stop, he spoke for the first time. "You think you understand, Holmes," he sneered, his voice rough, "but you have no idea what you're dealing with. The box is nothing compared to what's coming. You can't stop it." Holmes' gaze remained unwavering. "I've stopped much worse, my dear fellow. But you're right about one thing. You've just given me the final piece of the puzzle." Holmes turned to Watson. "We need to get to that box, Watson. Now." Before Watson could respond, the train screeched to a halt at the station. The doors slid open with a hiss, and the cold air rushed in, cutting through the compartment like a knife. Holmes didn't hesitate. He grabbed the wooden box from Lena's hands, and without a word, he gestured for her to follow him. "We're leaving the train now," Holmes said, his tone hard, urgent. Lena followed him without question, her footsteps quick and unsteady. Watson, ever the loyal companion, grabbed the man's arm and dragged him along, despite his protests. "Where are we going?" Lena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "To the station office," Holmes replied. "It's time we found out exactly what we're dealing with." As they moved through the narrow passageway, Holmes remained alert, his eyes scanning every face, every movement. There was something about the air at this station, something that felt wrong, as if they were walking directly into a trap. They stepped onto the snowy platform, the wind howling around them. The station was quiet, with only a few scattered figures huddling near the warmth of a small building. Holmes led the way, his long coat billowing behind him as he moved with purpose toward the small building at the far end of the platform. Holmes, you're not seriously thinking of opening the box here, are you? Watson asked, his voice tinged with concern. Holmes shot him a glance. We don't have the luxury of waiting any longer, Watson. We need answers, and we need them now. The station office was dimly lit, the single oil lamp casting flickering shadows across the room. Inside, a few crates were stacked in the corner, and a desk sat near the window. Holmes wasted no time. He placed the box on the desk and began to carefully examine the intricate carvings on its surface. His fingers moved with the precision of a man who had studied countless objects like this before, searching for a hidden mechanism or clue. This box, it's designed to keep people out, Holmes muttered, his brow furrowed in concentration. But it also holds a secret. Something that could change everything. Lena watched him, her hands trembling. Mr. Holmes, please. What is inside it? What does it mean? Holmes paused for a moment, looking at Lena with a calm but knowing expression. Patience, Mr. Brovsky, he said softly. We will know soon enough. Just as Holmes was about to unlock the box, a sudden noise outside caught his attention. He froze, his eyes narrowing. Something wasn't right. Watson, check the door, he ordered, his voice low and steady. We're not alone. Watson moved swiftly to the door, peering through the crack. His hand moved toward his medical bag instinctively, but his fingers froze when he saw who was standing outside. A group of men, dressed in dark coats and scarves, were moving toward the building. Their eyes locked on Holmes and Lena. They were too well dressed to be simple travelers, and their expressions were hard, determined. These men were not here by accident. Holmes, we're being watched, Watson said urgently. Holmes didn't need a look to know it was true. He closed the box slowly, his face set with grim determination. It seems, Holmes said, turning to face Lena, that the game is far from over. And as the men approached, Holmes knew that whatever secrets the box held, they would soon be uncovered, whether they were ready for it or not. The chase had truly begun. You said, Ab Chapter 6, Lico complete. Chapter 6, The Chase Through the Snow. The small station had turned into a ghost town. The wind howled as it swept through the platform, swirling snowflakes into the air like a white blanket over the world. The building, dimly lit by a single oil lamp, offered little protection from the biting cold. Inside, the tension was palpable. Holmes stood by the desk, his eyes fixed on the closed box, his mind racing. Watson was still by the door, peering out into the snowstorm, keeping watch for any sign of movement. Lena, standing beside Holmes, looked on anxiously, her breath shallow. Mr. Holmes, what are we going to do? She asked, her voice tight with fear. Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned the box over in his hands, inspecting every inch of its intricate carvings. The time for answers is nearly here, Mr. Brovsky, he said calmly, though his mind was already calculating their next move. But the men outside, they're not here to ask questions. They're here to take the box, and I have no intention of letting them do that. Watson's voice cut through the tension. Holmes, they're closing in. We need to move now. Holmes turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. I know, Watson. I know. There was no time to waste. Holmes knew that as soon as those men entered the station building, they would be trapped. The station wasn't large and there was only one exit. They needed a plan and they needed it quickly. Lena, give me the box, Holmes said, his tone firm. Watson, you take the back exit and make sure no one follows us. I'll lead Miss Dubrovsky through the front. We'll make our way to the woods. They won't expect us to leave the train station in the storm." Lena hesitated for a moment, but she handed over the box. Her hands were shaking, and Holmes could see the fear in her eyes, but she trusted him. It was clear she had no idea what else to do. "This is our only chance," Holmes said, his voice soft but unwavering. "Move quickly. Follow my lead." Holmes opened the door to the station, and the icy wind slapped them in the face, but there was no turning back. They stepped into the swirling snow, the station building now looming behind them like an ominous shadow. Watson had already disappeared around the corner, no doubt preparing for their escape. The snow crunched beneath their feet as they made their way toward the tree line, the wind cutting through their coats. Holmes moved quickly, Lena following closely behind, her footsteps barely audible against the howling storm. She was trying to keep up, but Holmes could sense her growing panic with every step. The men outside were closing in, and they didn't have much time. As they reached the edge of the trees, Holmes paused, looking back toward the station. He could make out shadows moving inside, the men preparing to pursue. "We must make it to the river," Holmes muttered to Lena. "If we can get there before they do, we can lose them in the current. It's the only chance we have." Lena nodded silently, her face pale with fear. Her hand reached for the wooden box again, clutching it tightly to her chest. Holmes glanced at her, his eyes sharp. "Do you trust me, Miss Dubrovsky?" Holmes asked, his voice low and steady. She looked at him, her eyes wide with uncertainty, but there was something in her gaze. A flicker of hope, perhaps, or maybe desperation. "Yes," she whispered. "I trust you." Without another word, Holmes turned and started running through the thick snow. The cold bit into his skin, but he ignored it, focusing solely on the path ahead. He didn't need to look back. He could hear the faint crunching of footsteps behind them, too close for comfort. "Stay close, Lena," Holmes shouted over his shoulder. They pushed through the trees, the snow piling up higher with each passing minute. The storm made everything seem eerily silent, but Holmes could hear the sound of his own breath, harsh and ragged. He didn't dare slow down. They couldn't afford to. Every second counted. Behind them, the sound of footsteps grew louder. The men weren't far behind. They were getting closer. Holmes's eyes darted around, trying to find a way to lose them. They couldn't keep running forever. They had to make a stand, or, at the very least, create a diversion. "This way," Holmes shouted, veering sharply to the left toward a small cluster of trees. He turned to Lena, his voice urgent. "We need to hide. Now." They ducked behind the trees, and Holmes pulled Lena down with him. He could hear the men's voices now, muffled by the storm but unmistakably closing in. They had no time to waste. Holmes turned to Lena. "Give me the box," he said again, more firmly this time. Lena hesitated, but she placed the box in his hands. She was scared, but she trusted him. Holmes held the box carefully, running his fingers over the carvings. He could sense that they were nearing the moment of truth. Whatever was inside that box would be revealed soon, but it couldn't happen here in the open with danger so close. Holmes turned to Lena, his eyes hardening. "We need to move again. The men are right behind us. If we stay here, they'll catch us." Lena nodded, swallowing hard. "What should we do?" Holmes gave her a quick, decisive look. "We head for the river. It's our only way out." The two of them broke from the trees, making their way toward the frozen river. The storm made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, but Holmes's mind was sharp. He knew the terrain. The river would be their best bet. The current might not be strong enough to carry them away, but it can help them lose the pursuers. They reached the river's edge, the ice cold and treacherous beneath their feet. Holmes stepped onto the bank, his boots crunching in the snow. He turned back to Lena, motioning for her to stay behind a large rock. "I'll create a distraction," Holmes said. "You stay here. Wait for my signal." Lena nodded, her face pale, her body trembling from the cold. Holmes hesitated for a moment before turning back toward the woods. He knew the men were closing in, but he had a plan. It was a risk, but it was their only chance. With the box still firmly in his hands, Holmes ran toward the edge of the woods, knowing the men would be watching for him. As he sprinted, he took a deep breath, pulling his coat tightly around him to keep the cold from slowing him down. The men were just on the other side of the trees. Holmes heard them before he saw them. There was no mistaking the crunch of snow and the sound of heavy boots behind him. "Now!" Holmes shouted, turning abruptly and hurling the box toward a nearby tree. It landed with a soft thud, drawing the men's attention for just a moment. In that moment, Holmes darted toward the river, where Lena was waiting. The men shouted from behind him, realizing too late that they had been misled. But by then, it was too late for them to stop him. Holmes and Lena reached the river, and without a second thought, Holmes grabbed her hand and led her onto the ice. As they crossed the riverbank, Holmes felt the weight of the box in his hand, but he didn't look back. There was no time to wonder what it contained. What mattered now was survival, and the game, he knew, was far from over. Chapter 7. Into the heart of the storm. The ice beneath their feet groaned with the weight of their steps as Holmes and Lena made their way across the frozen river. The storm raged around them, the wind howling, the snow blurring everything into a world of white. The trees on the other side of the river were little more than dark silhouettes, swaying violently in the gusts. Holmes could barely see a few feet in front of him, but he kept moving, pulling Lena along behind him. "Keep up, Mr. Brovsky," Holmes shouted above the wind, his voice rough with urgency. "We need to get to cover." Lena's breath was ragged, her face pale from the cold. "But the box, mister." "Holmes, what if they catch up?" Holmes turned briefly, his expression sharp. "They won't catch us." "Not if we stay ahead." His eyes flicked down to the wooden box in his hands, and a flicker of something dark crossed his features, but he quickly masked it. "The box is secure for now. Our priority is to get to shelter." Lena nodded, though her movements were slower, more hesitant. She was exhausted, the cold wearing her down, and the weight of the chase was heavy on her shoulders. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice strained. Holmes didn't answer immediately. He scanned the landscape, his sharp eyes searching for anything that could offer them a safe place to regroup. Then, as if struck by inspiration, he pointed toward a distant set of trees. "There," he said, his voice cutting through the wind. "We can take refuge there. Move quickly." They pushed through the snow, the distance between them and the men pursuing them widening. But Holmes knew that the storm would work against them just as much as it would work for them. The men had trackers, no doubt, but the snowstorm would slow them down. If they could get to the trees and hide, they might have a chance to plan their next move. As they neared the trees, Holmes's mind raced, analyzing the situation. The box in his hands was far more than a simple object of interest. It was the key to something larger, something dangerous. But what? And why was it so important? These were questions he had no answers to, but they haunted him all the same. "Do you think we've lost them?" Lena asked, her voice quieter now, the exhaustion beginning to show. Holmes looked back toward the river. The storm had obscured any view of the station behind them, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the men were still out there, hunting. "We haven't lost them yet," he said, though there was no certainty in his voice. "We need to keep moving." They reached the shelter of the trees, and Holmes quickly scanned their surroundings. It wasn't ideal. There were no buildings or structures, just the sparse, snow-covered woods. But it was better than being out in the open. Holmes motioned for Lena to sit behind a large tree trunk, its thick bark offering some protection from the wind. Holmes crouched down beside her, keeping the box close to him. "Stay here, Miss Dubrovsky," he said. "Don't make a sound. I'll keep watch." Lena nodded, her face tight with anxiety, but she didn't argue. She was too tired to fight, too weary to do anything but comply. She wrapped her arms around her body, trying to retain whatever warmth she could, though the cold seemed to seep into her very bones. Holmes moved a little further into the trees, his mind working furiously. He couldn't stay here long. He knew the men would be searching the riverbank, and when they didn't find them, they would turn toward the woods. It was only a matter of time before the pursuit resumed. He crouched down behind a low bush, scanning the area. The storm had reduced visibility to mere feet, but that also meant their pursuers were at a disadvantage. Holmes had the upper hand, for now. As he looked back toward the trees, his thoughts turned to Lena, her father's legacy, the mysterious box. It was all starting to come together in fragments, but the truth remained elusive, like a shadow that danced just out of reach. Holmes felt the weight of that truth pressing on him. What was inside the box? And why had so many people been willing to kill for it? But before he could ponder further, a soft crunch of snow interrupted his thoughts. Holmes's heart raced, and he immediately moved into a crouch, his hand instinctively reaching for the small revolver he carried at his side. The sound was faint, but it was unmistakable, the crunch of boots against snow. Someone was coming. He motioned to Lena, signaling her to remain silent. Her eyes widened, and she nodded, her expression filled with dread. Holmes's fingers tightened around the revolver as he moved into position behind a tree, his eyes narrowing. The footsteps were getting closer, the sound of snow shifting underfoot growing louder. The first man appeared through the trees, his dark coat blending with the snowstorm, his face obscured by the falling snow. Holmes could make out little more than his silhouette, but it was enough to know that this was one of the men who had been chasing them. Holmes watched him carefully, calculating. He needed to wait for the right moment to act. One wrong move, and they would be exposed. The man took another step, his eyes scanning the trees. But Holmes didn't wait for him to get closer. He darted from his position, moving quickly through the trees. He knew the terrain better than anyone. As the man took another step, Holmes lunged, using the element of surprise to tackle him to the ground. The man let out a muffled curse, but Holmes had already pulled the revolver from his belt. He aimed it directly at the man's chest, the barrel cold in his hand. "Stay still," Holmes ordered, his voice low but firm. The man froze, his eyes widening. You don't know what you're doing," he said through gritted teeth. "You're making a mistake." Holmes's gaze hardened. "I don't think so." "Now, you'll tell me who you're working for." The man didn't respond immediately. His eyes flickered toward the trees, toward the direction his comrades might be coming from. But Holmes kept the gun trained on him, unflinching. He wasn't about to let this man slip away. Not when they were so close to finding the truth. "Tell me, and I'll let you go," Holmes said. His voice was smooth, but there was an underlying menace to it. The man laughed bitterly. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice low. "You think you're in control, but you're just a pawn. All of us are." Holmes's expression hardened. "I don't care about your games." He pressed the barrel of the gun closer. "Tell me who you're working for, or this ends now." The man's smile faltered, and for a moment it seemed as though he was about to give in. Then, with a sudden movement, he threw his weight to the side, knocking the gun from Holmes's hand and rolling away. Holmes reacted immediately, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it behind his back. But before he could subdue him fully, the sound of approaching footsteps reached his ears. More men. They were closing in. "We don't have time for this," Holmes muttered. He released the man and shoved him to the ground, making a quick retreat toward Lena. "Get up, Miss Dobrovsky," Holmes said urgently. "We need to move. Now." Lena scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide with fear. She had no time to ask questions. Holmes grabbed her hand, pulling her through the trees. There was no longer any safety in the woods. They were too exposed. "Holmes, what now?" Lena asked, breathless. Holmes didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the area ahead. "The only way out is forward. We find shelter, and we hold them off until we know what's in that box." And with that, they plunged deeper into the storm, knowing that whatever was coming next, they couldn't stop now. They had already crossed the point of no return. Chapter 8. The Hidden Hand. The storm was relentless, the howling wind pushing against them with every step. Holmes and Lena pressed on through the thick forest, the snow growing deeper with each passing minute. They could no longer hear the footsteps of the men who had been chasing them, but Holmes knew they weren't far behind. The woods were a maze of trees and shadows, and although the storm was on their side, it wouldn't be long before the men would adapt. Holmes's mind was sharp, analyzing every option, every possibility. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. Not now. He glanced at Lena, whose face was pale with exhaustion, her eyes wide with fear, but also a flicker of hope. She trusted him, and in that moment, that trust was their only lifeline. "Holmes," Lena said, her voice shaky but determined. "Where are we going?" Holmes turned to face her, his expression as serious as ever. "We need to find a safe place to regroup, I've been thinking." He paused, scanning the dense trees around them. "There's a hunting cabin not far from here. It's the only place I know that could provide us with shelter until we can make a more permanent plan." Lena's eyes widened with recognition. "The cabin near the river?" Holmes nodded. "Yes. It's isolated enough that no one will easily find us, but it's also close enough to give us access to the road should we need to leave in a hurry." They continued on, their progress slow but steady. Holmes knew time was running out, and the men wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. The box was no ordinary object. It was a key to something far more dangerous than either of them had imagined. Whoever controlled the box controlled a secret buried deep in Russian history, one that, if revealed, could shift the balance of power in the world. Holmes had only pieced together fragments of the puzzle, but he could sense the gravity of it, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized that Lena's father had known exactly what he was doing when he entrusted her with the box. It was a burden, a deadly, dangerous burden, but one that had been thrust upon her, whether she was prepared for it or not. "We're almost there," Holmes said, his voice cutting through the snowstorm. Lena didn't respond, her face drawn with worry, but she kept pace with him, her steps slow and cautious. She was no longer asking questions. She was simply following, trusting, that Holmes knew the way. When they finally reached the hunting cabin, Holmes pushed the door open with a soft creak. The interior was dark and musty, the faint scent of old wood filling the air. It was a simple place, nothing fancy, just the bare necessities. There was a small stove in the corner, a wooden table, and a few chairs. The windows were covered with thick curtains blocking out the storm. Holmes immediately moved to the stove and began preparing a fire, his movements swift and precise. "We need to warm up," he said, "and we need to think. We're not out of danger yet." Lena stood near the door, her back pressed against the wooden frame. Her eyes were distant, but Holmes could tell she was deep in thought. The box in her hand seemed to weigh 100 pounds, though it was light as air. She had been clutching it since the moment Holmes had taken it from her, and he could see the conflict in her eyes. She was scared, terrified even, but there was also a sense of determination, as though she had made a decision. "I don't know what to do anymore, Mr. Holmes," she said softly. This is all too much. I don't even know what's in the box, but I know people are willing to kill for it. I don't know who I can trust." Holmes finished setting the fire and turned to her, his gaze steady. "I understand your fear, Miss Dabrowski, but we don't have time for hesitation. What's inside that box is the key to everything." Lena's hands tightened around the box. "You keep saying that, but you still haven't told me what's inside it." "Why is it so important?" Holmes sighed, a quiet frustration creeping into their voice. "I don't know everything, Lena, but I know enough to understand that the box is a symbol. Your father wasn't just a businessman, he was involved in something much larger. He was protecting something, and that something is in the box. What's inside could change everything." Lena's face twisted with confusion and fear. "But how do you know that? You keep talking about history, about power, but it's just a box. A box I don't understand." Holmes crossed the room and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You may not understand it, but you will. This isn't just about your father. It's about the future of many people. There are forces at play here, forces you can't even imagine. Your father was trying to protect you and the world from something terrible." Lena looked down at the box, her expression unreadable. "Then what am I supposed to do, Mr. Holmes? I don't even know what's inside." Holmes stepped back, his mind racing. "We can't open it here, not yet. But I need you to trust me, Lena. The truth will come, but it's not going to be easy." Just then, the sound of footsteps outside the cabin caught his attention. Holmes's eyes narrowed. The storm was still fierce, but someone was approaching. He motioned for Lena to move into the corner of the room out of sight. "Stay quiet," Holmes whispered, his voice low and urgent. "We're not alone." Lena's breath caught in her throat, and she instinctively clutched the box tighter. Holmes moved toward the door, his hand on the revolver at his side. He didn't need to look through the window to know who was outside. He could hear them, the same men who had been chasing them. They were close. Holmes took a deep breath, his mind working quickly. The men were only moments away from reaching the cabin, and if they didn't act fast, they would be trapped again. But this time, Holmes wasn't going to let them get away with it. "Lena, when I give the signal, you run. Do you understand?" he said, his voice firm. Lena nodded, her face pale but resolute. "I understand." Holmes turned back to the door. He couldn't let them take the box. Not now. He had to act. As the door creaked open just slightly, Holmes knew that everything was about to change. There was no more running, no more hiding. It was time to face the storm head on. "Here we go," Holmes whispered to himself. "Time to end this." And with that, he swung open the door, stepping out into the snowstorm once again, ready to confront whatever lay ahead. Chapter 9. The web tightens. The air was thick with the storm, the snow falling so heavily that even the trees seemed to be vanishing into the whiteness. Holmes and Lena moved quickly through the forest, the weight of the box and the map still heavy in Holmes's hand. They had uncovered something monumental, something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. The map inside the box wasn't just a guide, it was the key to a centuries-old secret, one that could shift the course of history. But with that revelation came the undeniable truth. They weren't the only ones after it. Holmes's sharp eyes were constantly scanning their surroundings, his instincts telling him that they were being followed. The men who had been chasing them were relentless, and now, with the map in their possession, Holmes knew they would stop at nothing to get it back. Lena, walking beside him, was quiet, her face pale from the cold and the exhaustion of the journey. Her eyes were fixed on the box, the mysterious map still weighing heavily on her mind. "Holmes," she said, breaking the silence between them, her voice low and filled with uncertainty. "What exactly is this map leading to? What did my father get involved in?" Holmes didn't answer immediately, his mind working through the pieces of the puzzle. He glanced down at the map, his fingers grazing its delicate surface. He could feel the pull of its mystery, the weight of its history. He had seen maps like this before, maps that led to more than just treasure or land, but to something far more elusive and dangerous. "I'm not entirely sure yet, Miss Dubrovsky," Holmes replied, his voice steady but tinged with an underlying tension. "But what I do know is that this map leads to something very ancient, something hidden by those who have spent centuries protecting it. Your father's involvement in the secret society, whatever it was no accident. He must have discovered something he wasn't supposed to, something that threatened the delicate balance of power that these people have maintained for centuries." Lena's face was a mixture of confusion and fear. A secret society? But who were they? Why was my father involved? Holmes paused, his gaze narrowing as he considered her question. He knew the answer was close, but it was just out of reach. "The society your father was part of is much older than you might imagine. They've been operating in the shadows for generations, influencing events, controlling the flow of power, money, and knowledge. They are the ones who ensure that certain secrets remain hidden, and they will do anything to keep it that way." Lena's hands tightened around the box, as though the weight of their conversation had added even more pressure. "What could be so dangerous that they would kill for it?" Holmes exhaled slowly, his breath fogging in the cold air. "That's what we need to find out, Lena. The map leads to something powerful, something hidden for a reason. Whoever controls it controls a secret that could change everything." They reached the edge of the forest, and Holmes held up a hand to signal that they should slow down. He turned to Lena. "We need to be careful. We're close to a road now, but we can't risk being seen. The men who are after us won't give up. They know exactly what they're looking for." Lena nodded, her eyes scanning their surroundings nervously. "And what do we do now? We can't keep running forever." Holmes glanced down at the map in his hand. "We find a way to get to the source of the secret. We follow the map no matter where it leads." Just as Holmes spoke, the wind shifted and the sound of distant voices carried on the air. His sharp ears picked up the faint sound of footsteps crunching in the snow. The men were close. Holmes's gaze sharpened and he motioned for Lena to crouch down behind a nearby rock. He dropped to one knee, pulling the revolver from his coat and checking it quickly. His mind raced. They had to move. "They're close," Holmes whispered. "We can't stay here. I'll go first and draw them off. You take the back route." Lena shook her head, her face filled with both fear and defiance. "I'm not leaving you." Holmes held her gaze for a moment, then sighed. He didn't have time to argue with her. "Fine," he said, his voice low but filled with resolve. "Stay close. We'll move quickly and quietly." They waited for the sound of the footsteps to grow closer. Then, in one swift motion, Holmes moved out from behind the rock, making sure his movements were deliberate and loud enough to be noticed. The men would hear him and they would think he was alone. The footsteps grew louder as Holmes moved, drawing the attention of the men. He kept moving, stepping lightly but deliberately, leading them away from Lena. He could hear them following, but he didn't dare look back. The plan was simple. Get them away from Lena, give her a chance to slip past them, and get to the road. But just as Holmes was about to turn toward a small hill to put some distance between himself and the men, he felt a sharp pain in his side. He stumbled, his hand flying to his waist. Blood seeped through his fingers. "Holmes!" Lena's voice rang out in panic. He turned to see her standing behind him, the fear in her eyes palpable. But there was no time to reassure her. The men were closing in, and he was too exposed. Holmes's mind raced, but his body was beginning to slow. The wound was deep, and he could feel the warmth of his own blood running freely. But he couldn't afford to fall now, not when they were so close to uncovering the truth. "Lena," Holmes said through gritted teeth, "get to the road. Go now." She hesitated for a split second, but then she nodded, her eyes filled with dogged determination. She turned and ran, disappearing into the storm. Holmes took a step forward, forcing himself to keep moving, though his vision was starting to blur. He wasn't going to let this end like this. Not now. Not when he was so close to the truth. But as he stumbled through the snow, blood staining the white ground beneath him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The men were too close. They were closing in, and their objective had never been clearer. They weren't just after the box anymore, they were after him. As Holmes pushed forward, fighting the darkness creeping in around the edges of his vision, he heard the unmistakable crunch of footsteps behind him. The men had caught up, and this time, they weren't going to let him escape. "Lena!" he called, his voice hoarse, but he knew it was too late. The men had already surrounded him. In that moment, Holmes realized one terrible truth. The secret he had been chasing, the mystery that had driven him forward, had just become a fight for survival. And the storm was only beginning. Chapter 10. The Final Gamble. The snow had begun to fall heavier, the flakes turning into a near impenetrable curtain that wrapped around Holmes and the men who had closed in on him. His body felt weak, the pain in his side from the gunshot radiating with every breath he took. His vision blurred, and the weight of the map, now tucked safely in his coat, seemed almost too heavy to bear. He stumbled again, barely keeping his balance, but he could hear them closing in, the hunters, relentless, determined. He couldn't let them win. Not now. "You've made this difficult, Holmes," one of the men called out, his voice muffled by the wind but clear enough to hear. "But you should have known better than to cross us." Holmes's breath was shallow, each step harder than the last, but he forced himself to keep moving. The woods ahead were dense, the cover of trees offering no guarantee of safety, but it was all he had left. Behind him, he heard the crunch of boots in the snow as they followed his every movement. His mind raced through the options. He couldn't fight them. He didn't have the strength to outrun them, but he had one last card to play. One final chance to shift the odds in his favor. He reached into his coat and pulled out the box, his fingers trembling from the cold and pain, and with a sudden movement, he dropped it into the snow ahead of him, just within sight. The men saw it immediately, their eyes catching the glint of the worn wood. It was a calculated risk, a gamble that he hoped would buy him the time he desperately needed. The lead man, a tall figure with a cruel sneer, stopped in his tracks. "The box," he muttered, a flicker of greed crossing his face. "So, you were trying to hide it, weren't you?" Holmes said nothing, just kept moving, his eyes darting for any sign of an escape. The pain in his side was blurring his thoughts, but he had to act quickly. "Pick it up," the man ordered one of his companions, "and bring it here." As the man approached the box, Holmes's hand shot into his coat pocket, retrieving a small, intricate device he had kept hidden for just such a moment. He had prepared for this, prepared for the moment when he might need to turn the tables. The device, a small mechanical trigger hidden inside a coin-sized casing, was designed to create an explosion of smoke and noise. It wasn't deadly, but it would give him the distraction he needed. The man reached down, and with a single flick of Holmes's wrist, the device was activated. A loud bang echoed through the snowstorm, followed by a cloud of dense, acrid smoke that filled the clearing. "What the hell?" one of the men shouted as they were engulfed by the smoke, stumbling backward. In that split second, Holmes bolted toward the cover of the trees. His injured side screamed in protest, but he pushed through it, his heart pounding. The smoke was thick, blocking their sight and providing him the cover he needed to move unnoticed. He could hear their curses through the smoke, but he was already out of sight, weaving this through the trees, his breath ragged but steady. The storm was still fierce, but it masked his movements as the snow fell harder, creating a heavy silence. Holmes didn't stop running. He knew that this window of opportunity wouldn't last long. The men would regroup quickly and they would be angry, but now he had a head start, just enough time to reach the edge of the woods, where he knew the road was close. But his mind, sharp as ever, wasn't solely focused on escape. The map, the secret it led to. He had to get to the truth. He had to find out what his father had been protecting and why it mattered so much. It wasn't just about survival anymore. As Holmes neared the edge of the trees, his vision blurred again, the darkness from the wound beginning to close in. He forced his mind back into focus, his senses alert despite the haze that was spreading across his vision. The road was within reach. Then, just as he reached the edge of the woods, a shout cut through the air. "There he is!" Holmes froze. He hadn't been fast enough. One of the men had caught sight of him. With no choice left, Holmes stumbled onto the road, the familiar path now a blur of white under the storm's fury. He had no plan, no way to get away. But then, just as hope seemed lost, a vehicle appeared in the distance, its headlights cutting through the swirling snow. Holmes's heart leaped in his chest. He didn't know who it was, but he had no choice. He ran toward it, his legs threatening to give out beneath him, but he pushed on. The car slowed as it neared, the driver peering out through the windshield. "Holmes!" a voice called out, unmistakable in the storm. Holmes's eyes widened. It was Watson. He didn't hesitate. With the last of his strength, Holmes threw himself toward the car. Watson's hand shot out to pull him in. "Get in!" Watson shouted as Holmes collapsed into the passenger seat. The car took off immediately, tires crunching through the snow as it sped down the road, away from the woods and away from the danger. Holmes could barely keep his eyes open, the wound in his side taking its toll. But the relief that washed over him was enough to keep him conscious for just a little while longer. "You're going to be all right, Holmes," Watson said, his voice urgent but calm. "Just hold on. We'll get you to safety." Holmes nodded weakly, though he could feel the darkness creeping around the edges of his vision. The storm raged outside, but inside the car there was a moment of quiet. And in that moment, as Holmes closed his eyes, he felt something stir deep within him. A realization that the chase wasn't over. The men would be back. The truth was still hidden. But for now, they had a chance to breathe. "The map," Holmes whispered, his voice barely audible. "We need to—" But before he could finish, unconsciousness claimed him and the world went dark. Chapter 11. Into the Abyss. Holmes drifted in and out of consciousness as the car sped down the snow-covered road, its headlight cutting through the blinding storm. The world around him was a blur of white, the steady rumble of the engine, the only thing anchoring him to reality. His side throbbed with pain, and every time he stirred, the sharp sting of his wound sent jolts of discomfort through his body. Yet despite it all, he fought to remain alert, to stay with the moment. The last thing he remembered before slipping into unconsciousness was Watson's voice, urging him to hold on. But now he was adrift. His thoughts fragmented, his body exhausted and broken. The box, the map, and the mystery surrounding it all felt like distant memories, just out of reach. But even in his weakened state, Holmes's mind refused to quiet. What did the map lead to, he thought, a gnawing feeling in his gut. The storm outside seemed like the least of his concerns. It was the storm of truth that awaited him, one far more dangerous than any physical wound. The car jolted slightly as it hit a bump in the road, rousing him from his delirium. Holmes groaned, his eyes fluttering open. "Holmes? Holmes." It was Watson's voice again, clear and panicked. Holmes tried to focus on his friend, but his vision was blurry, his head heavy. "Watson?" Holmes croaked, his voice weak. "Thank God, you're awake," Watson said, relief flooding his voice. He glanced over at Holmes from the driver's seat, his expression taut with concern. "We're almost there. Just hold on, all right?" Holmes nodded faintly, though his thoughts were still muddled. Where exactly was Watson taking him? They had to get to safety, yes, but what came next? The men who had been hunting them? The mystery of the map and the box. It all weighed on him. "The box," Holmes murmured, his voice barely audible. Watson shot a worried glance at him. "I've got it." "It's safe." Holmes's brow furrowed slightly, though his eyelids were heavy. "The map," he breathed out. "We need to follow it. We need to reach the source." Watson gave him a confused but concerned look. "We will, Holmes. We'll follow through. You just rest for now." Holmes tried to protest, to keep his mind sharp, but his body was refusing to cooperate. The world was slipping away again, and he could feel the edges of his consciousness blurring. Before he could say another word, the darkness claimed him once more. The car finally came to a halt, the screech of tires on snow, the last sound Holmes heard, before everything went black. When he awoke again, the storm had subsided slightly, but the cold was still biting. He was in a small, dimly lit room, lying on a worn couch covered with blankets. His side still hurt, the throbbing pulse a constant reminder of how close he had come to losing everything. He could hear soft footsteps, and then the familiar sound of Watson's voice. "You're awake," Holmes blinked, trying to focus on his surroundings. "Where am I?" he rasped, his throat dry. "We're in a safe house," Watson said, his voice steady but still laced with concern. "It's a small cabin up in the mountains. No one knows about this place. You're safe for now." Holmes tried to sit up, but the pain in his side flared sharply, and he collapsed back onto the couch, groaning. "Easy, Holmes. You've been through a lot," Watson said, his hand resting gently on Holmes's shoulder. "You need to rest." Holmes turned his head toward his friend, his mind still trying to piece things together. "The box?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Where is it?" Watson nodded toward the small table in the corner. The box sat there unopened, the map inside it still a mystery. "It's there, Holmes. Safe. But what's really going on? Why did they want this box so badly? Who are they?" Holmes's eyes flickered with understanding. "The men who were after us, they aren't just thugs, Watson. They're part of something much bigger. The box is a symbol, a key to something ancient. A secret society has been guarding it for centuries. Your father was involved in this, Miss Dabrowski. It's more than just treasure or artifacts. It's about power. Real power." Watson's brows furrowed. "A secret society? And your father, what did he discover?" Holmes winced, trying to sit up a little more, his mind racing. "I don't know everything yet, Watson. But I know enough to understand that we've stumbled onto something monumental. This isn't just about surviving anymore. It's about the world, the balance of power, the things that have been kept hidden for centuries." He paused, his eyes shifting to the box, now sitting so innocently on the table. "We need to open it. We need to find out what's inside." Watson hesitated, his expression torn. "Holmes, are you sure? After everything we've been through, don't you think we should lay low, regroup, and get some answers from the people who are after us first?" Holmes shook his head, his resolve firm. "We don't have the luxury of waiting any longer. They'll come for us again, Watson, and when they do, we need to be ready." Watson sighed, though his face softened. "You're right, of course, but we'll need to be smart about this. There's no turning back once we open it." Holmes nodded. "I know, but we don't have any choice." Together they stood. Watson moved toward the box, and Holmes followed slowly, his body still protesting, but his mind sharp and focused. Watson hesitated just before lifting the lid. "Ready?" Watson asked, his voice thick with anticipation and uncertainty. Holmes's eyes locked onto the box, and for the first time since the madness had started, he felt a deep, chilling certainty. "Yes," he said softly. "Let's find out what we're really dealing with." With a final breath, Watson opened the box. The world seemed to stop as the lid creaked open, and inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a small, ancient book. Its cover was worn, the leather faded, but the symbols etched into it were unmistakable. The language was foreign, ancient, and yet it pulsed with a strange energy, as if the book itself held the key to everything. Holmes reached out with trembling fingers, but before he could touch it, the sound of a distant engine, faint but growing louder, echoed through the window. Someone was coming. Holmes's eyes locked onto Watson's, and without a word, they knew what had to be done. "Get the book," Holmes whispered urgently. "It's time to end this." But as they rushed to grab the book, the door to the cabin swung open, and the silhouette of a man appeared in the doorway, his figure illuminated by the cold light of the storm outside. The game, it seemed, was far from over. Chapter 12. The Price of Secrets. The man in the doorway was a shadow against the blinding white storm outside, but there was something unmistakable about him. He exuded a quiet confidence, the kind that only comes from years of knowing exactly who you are and what you want. His dark coat was impeccably tailored, and his face was partially obscured by the snowstorm's bluster, but there was no mistaking the chilling presence he brought with him. Holmes's hand instinctively moved toward his revolver, but he didn't pull it out. Not yet. He couldn't afford to make a rash move. "I see you're still alive," the man said coldly, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "I wasn't sure you'd make it through the storm." Holmes didn't speak at first, his eyes studying the stranger as he processed the man's appearance. He wasn't one of the original pursuers. This man was something different. His aura spoke of authority, of someone who commanded more than just a group of thugs. "Who are you?" Holmes finally asked, his voice steady, though he could feel the burn of adrenaline coursing through him. The weight of the situation was rapidly shifting, and with every passing second, Holmes knew they were closer to the endgame. The man smiled faintly. "A man who doesn't like loose ends," he said, stepping into the cabin and closing the door behind him, blocking out the storm's fury. He scanned the room briefly, his eyes landing on the box on the table. Holmes's hand twitched toward the box, but the man noticed. His smile widened. "You really think you can keep it from me?" "You've had your fun, Holmes, but it's time to give up." Lena, who had been frozen with fear, finally found her voice. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice shaky but resolute. The man turned his gaze toward her, his eyes narrowing. "The map," he said simply. "The map, Mr. Brovsky." "You've had it long enough. Hand it over." Holmes's jaw tightened, but he didn't budge. "You're wasting your time," he said coolly. "You may have the upper hand, but that doesn't mean I'll give it to you." The man's eyes flicked back to Holmes, and there was a flicker of amusement in his gaze. "You still don't understand, do you? You're in over your head, all of you. This isn't just a box. This isn't about the map." Holmes felt a cold chill slide down his spine, and for the first time, he allowed the gravity of the situation to fully sink in. "Then what is it about?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man took a step forward, his presence suddenly much more menacing. "It's about control. It's about keeping things where they belong. You think the world you know is real, Holmes, that everything is in its place. But there are things beyond your understanding. Things that have been hidden from the world for centuries, and you've just scratched the surface." Lena's grip tightened on the box, her fingers pale from the force. She was trembling, but she wasn't about to give in. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice rising slightly. The man's lips curved into a faint, almost pitying smile. "I'm talking about a world that's always been there, just beneath the surface. Your father, he was a part of it, and you, Mr. Brovsky, are the key to unlocking it. That box contains more than just a map. It contains the key to a secret society that's controlled the world from the shadows. Your father understood that, and he was trying to protect you from it. But you've stepped into the game now, and you can't just walk away." Holmes watched the man closely, processing every word. This wasn't just about power or treasure. It was about something deeper, something far more dangerous. "Who are you?" Holmes demanded again, his voice laced with both curiosity and an edge of authority. The man chuckled, the sound low and unsettling. "I'm someone who ensures that the secrets of the world remain hidden. I belong to a group that has existed for centuries. We pull the strings, we direct the course of history. And your father, well, he was too curious for his own good. But that's the problem with curiosity, isn't it? It leads to destruction. Holmes's hand slid into his coat pocket again, fingers brushing the small device he had used earlier. He knew it wasn't much, just a diversion. But right now, he had no other options. His mind was working, calculating. "You've been tracking us," he said, his voice calm, though every fiber of his being screamed to act. "You knew about the map before we did." The man gave a tight smile. "Of course I did. I've been following your every move. You're not the first to stumble upon this. But you're the first to get this far. Your father's involvement made you a target, and now you've brought it all to the surface. You've made things complicated." Holmes knew that the man was right. He had walked right into a trap. No, they had. Lena's father's death, the box, the map. It was all connected to something far bigger. They had become part of a game they never understood. "And you expect us to just hand it over?" Holmes said, his tone sharp, eyes narrowing. The man stepped closer, his hand resting on the pistol holstered at his side. "I'm not asking, Holmes. I'm telling you, hand it over. Now." Holmes's heart raced, the realization dawning that they were out of options. There was no escape this time. He had no more tricks, no more devices to fall back on. He had to make a decision. Right here, right now. His mind raced as he exchanged a glance with Lena, whose face was pale but determined. There was no going back, no more running. The box wasn't just an object anymore. It was a symbol, a catalyst for something far more powerful and dangerous than they had ever realized. "You want the map?" Holmes said slowly, his voice calm. "But you don't know what it truly holds. If you open it, you might not be able to control what comes out." The man's eyes darkened. "You're in no position to threaten me, Holmes. Now give it to me." Holmes stood, his legs shaking but his resolve hardening. "You won't get it." "Not today." Lena's voice was barely a whisper, but Holmes heard it. "We can't give it to him, can we?" Holmes didn't answer. He didn't need to. In one swift motion, he grabbed the box and pushed Lena toward the back of the room. "Run!" he shouted just as the man lunged for him. It was chaos. The man reached for his gun, but Holmes was faster, knocking it from his hand. The struggle was brief, but fierce, the room filling with the sounds of the two men grappling. Lena, her heart pounding, turned and ran for the door, the box still clutched in her hands. "Lena!" Holmes shouted, his voice filled with urgency, but it was too late. The man recovered quickly, pulling a second weapon, aiming directly at Holmes. In that moment, time seemed to slow, and Holmes knew that everything had changed. Chapter 13. The Reckoning. The room was silent except for the sound of Holmes's ragged breathing and the pounding of his heart. The man's gun was aimed directly at him, cold and unflinching. Holmes stood frozen for a brief moment, his mind racing through possible strategies, weighing his options. He had no time to act with precision. This was a moment of pure instinct. Lena had already fled, and Holmes could only hope she was fast enough to escape. But the man before him wasn't about to let them go that easily. He had the box, he had the map, and he was going to make sure they paid forever standing in his way. "I told you." The man's voice was low and menacing, his eyes gleaming with an almost unsettling calm. "You never should have involved yourselves in this. The map isn't just a relic, Holmes. It's the key to everything." Holmes's eyes never left the man's, but his thoughts were racing. The truth behind the map was closer than ever, and yet it felt as if everything was slipping from his grasp. He had no more tricks, no more diversions. There was no escaping now. "You're making a mistake," Holmes said quietly, his voice even, his mind calculating. "You may think you're in control, but the secrets you're protecting are far too dangerous. You don't know what you're dealing with." The man's lips curled into a cold smile, his grip tightening on the gun. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with, Holmes." He took a step closer, his eyes gleaming with menace. "And you've already sealed your fate. I'm not here for negotiations. I'm here to end this." Holmes's mind snapped into focus. Every instinct told him that the moment to act was slipping away. But even in the face of certain death, his mind remained sharp. He had one last card to play. "You think you have the upper hand," Holmes said, his voice a mixture of calm and challenge. "But you're wrong." The man paused, his eyes narrowing, a flicker of doubt flashing across his features. "What do you mean?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath and made a sudden, deliberate move. He lunged toward the table, knocking the box off its surface and sending it flying across the room. The man's reflexes were fast, but not fast enough. In that instant, Holmes dove forward, knocking the man's gun hand away just as it fired. The shot went wild, missing Holmes by mere inches. The man cursed, his face twisting in rage. "You fool!" he shouted, trying to regain control of the weapon. But Holmes was already on him, twisting his arm and forcing him to the ground. "This isn't over," the man snarled, struggling beneath Holmes's grip. "You have no idea what's coming." Holmes didn't respond. Instead, he took advantage of the moment to disarm the man, wrenching the gun from his hand and tossing it aside. The man's breathing was heavy, his chest rising and falling with fury. "Who are you?" Holmes demanded, his grip tightening around the man's collar, his voice cold and commanding. The man's lips curled into a bitter grin, but his eyes were filled with something else, something darker. "It doesn't matter who I am. What matters is that you've made a dangerous enemy. You've set something in motion that can't be stopped." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "I've heard enough of your cryptic nonsense." He dragged the man to his feet, forcing him toward the door. "Tell me everything. Who are you working for? What is the secret behind the map?" The man laughed bitterly, his voice low and strained. "You think you can stop this? You've already unleashed the storm, Holmes. There's no turning back now." Just then, there was a sharp knock at the door. Holmes's instincts flared. He spun around, his hand reaching for the revolver that lay on the table, but before he could react, the door slammed open with a force that sent it rattling against the wall. "Holmes!" A familiar voice rang out, and Holmes's heart skipped a beat. Lena stood in the doorway, her face pale but determined. She was holding the box tightly in her hands, her eyes filled with fear, but also with something stronger, something resolute. "Lena!" Holmes shouted, his voice filled with relief. "What are you doing here?" "You need to get out of here, now." But Lena didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the man standing before her, the man who had just threatened them both. Her grip tightened on the box, and Holmes could see the storm in her eyes. She was no longer the terrified woman he had met days ago. She was someone else now, someone who had come to understand the weight of the truth. "No," she said firmly, her voice carrying a weight of authority that Holmes had never heard before. "I'm not running anymore, Mr. Holmes. It's time we finish this." Holmes's heart raced as he turned toward her, but before he could speak, the man in front of them broke free from his grasp. He lunged for the box, his face contorted with rage. "No!" Holmes shouted, but it was too late. The man reached out and snatched the box from Lena's hands, ripping it open with a violent motion. The lid fell to the floor with a sharp crack, and for a moment, all was still. Holmes's heart pounded in his chest as the man pulled something from inside the box, a small, ornate key. It was old, its metal darkened with age, but the energy surrounding it was palpable, as though it hummed with power. The man held the key up triumphantly, his face lit with twisted satisfaction. "This is it," he said, his voice thick with triumph. "The key to everything." Lena's eyes widened, and for a split second, Holmes saw a flash of recognition in her face. She understood what this meant. The key wasn't just a piece of metal. It was the final piece of a puzzle. The key that unlocked a secret society's centuries-old hold on power. But the man's victory was short-lived. Before he could make another move, Holmes lunged at him, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it with all his strength. The key fell to the floor, bouncing across the room. "You don't control this anymore," Holmes growled, his voice fierce and filled with purpose. "You've lost." The man, now on the floor, glared at him with fury, but it was clear he was beaten. Holmes grabbed the key from the floor, his fingers curling around it. The man could only watch in helpless rage. "It's over," Holmes said quietly, his voice cold and final. For a moment, there was only silence. The storm outside continued to howl, but inside the cabin, everything had changed. The game had shifted, and with the key in his hand, Holmes knew they were closer to uncovering the truth than ever before. But as he looked down at the key, he realized something far more dangerous was waiting for them. They weren't just dealing with a secret society anymore. They were dealing with something far more ancient and far more powerful. The storm had just begun. Chapter 14. The Unraveling. The wind howled outside the cabin, its fury undiminished by the brief calm that had settled inside. Holmes stood over the fallen man, the key clenched tightly in his hand. It was cold, ancient, and alive with secrets. Secrets that had been hidden for centuries. And now, after all this chaos, they were finally within reach. Lena, still standing by the door, watched the exchange in silence. The storm outside mirrored the storm that raged in her heart. For so long, her life had been a series of carefully controlled events, and then, all at once, it had spiraled into chaos. The death of her father, the discovery of the box, the men chasing them, the truth about the secret society. It was all a weight she wasn't sure she could bear. But in this moment, as she looked at the key in Holmes's hand, she knew one thing. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about power. Power that could change everything. What now? Lena's voice broke through the silence, her question soft but heavy with the weight of the truth. Holmes didn't immediately answer. He turned the key over in his hand, studying its intricate design. It was small, almost insignificant in appearance, but there was an undeniable energy to it. It was the kind of key that could unlock not just doors, but entire worlds. Worlds hidden beneath the surface of history. He turned toward the man who had been chasing them. The man was still on the floor, his face flushed with rage and frustration, but his body was slumped, defeated. His eyes burned with hatred, but there was something else. Fear. "You're not going to get away with this," the man snarled, his voice hoarse. "You've made a fatal mistake." Holmes's gaze was cold. "I don't think you're in a position to make threats anymore." Lena stepped closer, her eyes never leaving the key in Holmes's hand. She had come this far, had fought this hard to get here, but now that the key was in their possession, everything felt heavier. "What does it open?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Holmes looked up, his eyes sharp. "I don't know yet." He turned toward the man. "But you're going to help us find out." The man laughed bitterly, coughing as he tried to push himself to his feet. "You think I'll help you?" "You're too late. The society is bigger than you, Holmes. It's bigger than all of us." Holmes took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the man. "What do you mean? What is the society? Who's behind it?" The man smirked, though it was more a grimace than a smile. "You think you can stop us?" "We've been in control for centuries, manipulating events, controlling power, shaping history. You don't even understand the scale of it. You have no idea what you've unleashed." Holmes's grip tightened around the key. The man's words sent a shiver down his spine. "Tell me everything," he demanded. "Now." The man stared at him for a long moment, his eyes filled with a mix of contempt and fear. Then, with a sudden shift, his demeanor changed. His smirk faded, replaced by a look of resigned bitterness. "It's too late," he muttered, barely audible. "You've opened the door. There's no going back." Holmes exchanged a glance with Lena. They both felt the weight of his words, but they didn't have time to contemplate them. There was no more waiting, no more hesitation. The storm was closing in on them, and they had to act. "We need to go," Holmes said, his voice steady. "Now," Lena nodded, though her face was still etched with uncertainty. "Where do we go? What do we do next?" Holmes didn't hesitate. "We follow the map. It's the only way." They left the cabin quickly, the storm still raging outside, and made their way down a narrow, snow-covered path that led into the heart of the forest. Holmes's mind was focused solely on the map, his thoughts racing as he pieced together everything he had learned. He wasn't sure where the map would lead them, but one thing was clear. They were heading towards something much larger than they had anticipated. As they walked, Holmes kept a careful eye on their surroundings, listening for any sign that they were being followed. The man who had tried to stop them was still back in the cabin, but Holmes knew it wouldn't be long before more of them arrived. They had to be ready. "Holmes," Lena said suddenly, breaking the silence between them. "What if they're right? What if we've already gone too far?" Holmes didn't answer at first. He kept walking, his eyes scanning the trees ahead of them. Then after a moment he turned to her. "We've come this far, Lena," he said, his voice soft but firm. "There's no turning back now. But we can control what happens next. We find out what's hidden, we stop them, and we end this." Lena looked down at the map in her hands, her fingers trembling as she traced the lines on the paper. "But what if we don't make it out?" Holmes's face was hard, but there was a glint in his eye, a spark of something fierce. "We will," he said simply. "We'll make it. And we'll stop this." The path through the woods grew darker as they moved deeper into the forest, the trees crowding around them, their bare branches swaying ominously in the wind. Holmes knew they were close, too close to turn back. The map was leading them to somewhere, but where and why? Lena stopped suddenly, her eyes fixed on a distant point. "Holmes," she said, her voice shaking. "Look." Holmes followed her gaze. At the end of the path, a small clearing appeared, barely visible through the trees. In the center of the clearing stood a large, weathered stone structure, ancient and worn, as though it had been forgotten by time. Its surface was covered in moss, and strange symbols were etched into its walls. "What is that?" Lena whispered, her voice trembling. Holmes stepped forward cautiously, his eyes narrowing as he approached. "I don't know," he said, his voice low. "But it's where the map leads. This is it." They moved into the clearing, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of snow. The structure before them was no ordinary building. It was a temple of some sort, ancient and foreboding, its purpose lost to history. Holmes's heart raced. They had found it. They had found the place where the secret had been hidden. But as they approached the entrance, something shifted in the air, something unseen but unmistakable. It was as though the very ground beneath them was alive with energy, as if the secrets buried here were stirring, waiting to be awakened. "We're not alone," Holmes muttered, his eyes darting around the clearing. Lena stepped closer to him, her hand tightening around the map. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and determination. Holmes took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the temple's entrance. "We go in," he said, his voice steady. "This is where it all ends." And as they moved forward, the storm around them seemed to intensify, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Chapter 15. The Temple of Secrets. The entrance to the ancient temple loomed before them, a dark, foreboding doorway framed by worn stone carvings. The air around them seemed to hum, as though the very earth beneath their feet was alive with secrets waiting to be uncovered. Snowflakes swirled around them in a chaotic dance, but inside the temple, the world seemed still, unnaturally still. Holmes took a step forward, his breath misting in the cold air, his mind sharp despite the exhaustion and pain that still gnawed at him. He could feel the weight of the map in his pocket, a constant reminder that they had come too far to turn back now. This was the moment of truth. "Holmes," Lena whispered, her voice strained. "What's inside?" "What are we about to find?" Holmes glanced at her, his eyes filled with the same uncertainty she felt, but there was a flicker of resolve behind them. "The truth. Whatever it is, it will reveal everything, the society, your father's role, the power they've been hiding for centuries." He paused, his hand resting briefly on the stone. "We're walking into the heart of it now." Lena nodded, her grip tightening on the box. She didn't fully understand it all. How her father had been involved, why the box had been so crucial. But she knew this was her only chance to get the answers, to find out what had led her father to hide this from her, and why the men who chased them would kill to possess it. "Let's go," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear. "We don't have much time." Holmes led the way, pushing open the heavy stone door with a low, echoing groan. The air inside was cool and musty, the scent of old stone and dust filling their lungs as they stepped into the darkness. Faint light filtered through cracks in the walls, casting long, eerie shadows on the floor. It was a chamber far older than anything they had seen before, and every inch of it seemed a whisper of untold stories. As they moved further into the temple, the symbols carved into the walls became more intricate, the design strange and unfamiliar. There were markings, ancient cryptic runes, and a faint glow that seemed to emanate from them, pulsating with energy like a heartbeat. Holmes's hand rested on the revolver at his side, though he hadn't drawn it yet. Every instinct told him that this was no longer just a fight for survival. They had entered something far greater, a web of power, a conspiracy that had been brewing for centuries. And now, the key, the map, was in their hands. Lena walked beside him, the weight of the box a constant presence between them. Her steps faltered slightly as they moved deeper into the temple, her eyes scanning the walls, the strange symbols, her mind racing to make sense of it all. "Holmes," she said, her voice trembling. "What do we do now? What's the next step?" Holmes paused in front of a large stone pedestal, a figure carved into it, its features worn by time. "We need to find the altar," he said, his voice low but firm. "This place was built for a purpose. The map is the key to unlocking it. If we can reach the altar, we'll find what we're looking for." Lena stepped forward, the box still clutched tightly in her hands. "But how? How will we know where it is?" Holmes glanced around, his eyes scanning the vast space. The chamber was large, but the architecture was deliberate. The path forward carefully hidden beneath centuries of dust and decay. There was a presence here, something waiting to be found. "We'll follow the map," Holmes said, pulling it from his coat. He unfolded the ancient paper carefully, his eyes tracing the markings, the symbols. He was silent for a moment as he compared the map to the layout of the temple. Then his fingers pointed to a location near the far wall. "There," he said, his voice filled with certainty. "It's there. The altar is at the far end of the chamber beneath the archway." Lena followed his gaze, nodding. "Let's go." They moved cautiously toward the archway, the air growing colder the closer they got. The stone beneath their feet seemed to hum, vibrating with an energy that made the hairs on the back of Lena's neck stand on end. She could feel it now, the weight of history pressing down on her, the power of what was hidden here. As they approached the archway, something shifted in the air, an unseen force. The walls seemed to pulse, and the low hum in the air grew louder, like a chant that was almost within hearing distance. The entrance to the altar chamber loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. "Stay close," Holmes whispered. Lena nodded, her breath shallow, her heart racing. The door to the altar chamber opened silently before them, as if the very stone walls had parted to welcome them. Beyond the threshold, the space opened up into a vast cavernous room. It was lined with pillars, each carved with intricate symbols. The center of the room was dominated by a raised stone platform. An altar bathed in a faint, ethereal glow. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he moved forward, his hand gripping the box tightly. The air felt thick here, heavy with the weight of what was about to unfold. They were standing on the edge of something monumental. "This is it," Holmes said quietly, his voice filled with awe. "This is where it all began." Lena looked around, her eyes wide, taking in the grandeur of the place. "What is this? What did my father get involved in?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. He stepped forward, placing the box onto the altar. The symbols on the stone began to glow more brightly, their light pulsing in time with his heartbeat. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled, and the stone slab in front of the altar shifted, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small, ornate chest, covered in dust and time, but still untouched. Holmes's breath caught in his throat. He reached for the chest, his fingers trembling as he carefully lifted it out of the hidden compartment. He turned to Lena, his eyes filled with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "This is it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "This is the heart of it all." Lena took a step forward, her face a mix of fear and awe. "What's inside it, Holmes?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. He carefully opened the chest, revealing a set of ancient scrolls, their edges worn and frayed with age. The symbols on the scrolls were the same as those on the walls of the temple, the same as those on the map. But there was something else, something far more dangerous hidden beneath the scrolls. "It's not just knowledge," Holmes muttered, his voice cold. It's a weapon. A weapon of control. Whoever holds these scrolls holds the power to shape history itself. Lena's eyes widened as the realization hit her. The secret society wasn't just after power. It was after domination. And now they had it. They had uncovered the final piece of the puzzle. "What do we do now?" Lena asked, her voice trembling. Holmes's face was hard, his eyes set with determination. "We don't just stop them, Lena. We finish it, once and for all." The storm outside raged louder, as if in response to his words. They were standing on the precipice of something far greater than they could have imagined, and it was only just beginning. Chapter 16. The Last Stand. The chamber was still. The weight of centuries pressing down on Holmes and Lena as they stood in the heart of the ancient temple. The scrolls lay open on the altar, their secrets laid bare before them. Yet, despite the silence, Holmes could feel the air crackling with the energy of the knowledge they had uncovered. The pieces were in place, the map, the box, the scrolls. But one question still hung in the air, unanswered. What would they do with this power? Holmes's mind raced, but he kept his focus on the immediate danger. The men who had pursued them, the secret society. None of it was over yet. The temple itself seemed to hum with an unseen energy, as though it were waiting for something, or perhaps someone. Lena stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the scrolls, a mixture of awe and fear in her gaze. The truth of her father's involvement was finally clear, but with it came a terrifying weight. She had never wanted this responsibility, never asked for it, yet here she was holding the key to something that could change the world. "Holmes," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "What do we do now?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked between the scrolls and the entrance to the temple, knowing that time was running out. He could already hear the distant sound of footsteps, crunching in the snow outside. They weren't alone. "We finished this," he said finally, his voice hard with resolve. "We end it before they get any closer." Lena nodded, her hands shaking slightly as she clutched the scrolls. The weight of what they held seemed almost unbearable, and for the first time, she could feel the weight of her father's legacy pressing down on her. She wasn't just his daughter anymore. She was part of this, part of the ancient secret that had been hidden for generations. But with the truth came an undeniable question. What would they do with it? Holmes stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room one last time. "We have to destroy it," he said, his voice low, almost regretful. Lena's eyes widened. "Destroy it? Why? This is the key to everything. The knowledge. The power." "That's exactly why we can't let it fall into the wrong hands," Holmes interrupted, his voice hard. "This power, it's too dangerous. If we keep it, we become part of the problem." Lena took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. "But what if—" "No," Holmes said, cutting her off. "We can't risk it. If the society finds out we have this, they'll stop at nothing to take it back. The world can't be controlled by those who think they own it." Lena stood there for a moment, the decision weighing heavily on her. She could feel her father's presence, his choices, his actions. He had kept this secret from her, but now she understood why. He had never wanted this power, never wanted it to fall into the wrong hands. And yet, it had. But could she destroy it? "How do we destroy it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Holmes turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and regret. "There's a chamber deep beneath the temple. It's said to be the heart of this place. The place where all the secrets are hidden. If we destroy the scrolls there, we can erase everything. it'll be over. Lena swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the decision settle in her chest. She had come this far, uncovered so much, but this was different. She had the power to end it all, but it felt like she was holding the world in her hands. As they made their way toward the hidden passage, Holmes kept his eyes on the shadows around them. He knew they were being followed. The storm had subsided, but the danger was far from over. They had to move quickly. There was no time for hesitation. "We're almost there," Holmes said, his voice steady, though his eyes were sharp. "Stay close." The air in the temple seemed to grow colder as they descended into the bowels of the structure. The walls closed in around them, the flickering light from the torches casting strange shadows across the stone. The deeper they went, the more the temple seemed to pulse with energy, as though it were alive, waiting for them to reach the heart of it. Finally, they arrived at a massive stone door, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Holmes placed his hand on the door, feeling the energy that radiated from it. "This is it," he said quietly. "The heart of the temple. The chamber where the truth is buried." Lena stepped forward, her heart racing. The door slowly creaked open, revealing a dark, circular chamber at the center. The walls were covered in more ancient symbols, and in the center of the room was an altar, much larger than the one they had seen earlier. It was made of smooth, dark stone, and at its center, there was a deep indentation, as though it was waiting for something. Holmes stepped forward, carefully placing the scrolls on the altar. "This is where it ends," he muttered. Lena stood behind him, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of the moment, the culmination of everything that had happened. She looked down in the scrolls, her fingers brushing against them one last time. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice tight. Holmes didn't answer immediately. His hand hovered over the scrolls, and for a moment it seemed like the world was holding its breath. Then, with a decisive motion, he pushed the scrolls into the indentation on the altar. The room trembled, the ground beneath them shook, and the symbols on the walls began to glow brightly, casting an eerie light across the chamber. Lena gasped, stepping back as the altar seemed to come alive, the stone shifting beneath their feet. "It's working," Holmes said, his voice filled with awe and determination. "The power is being sealed away. This is the only way to end it." But as the chamber began to shake more violently, a voice echoed through the temple, booming and deep, as if it came from the very heart of the stone itself. "You think you can erase us? You think you can destroy what has been built for centuries?" Holmes froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice was familiar. Too familiar. Before he could react, a figure stepped out from the shadows at the edge of the chamber, his face hidden by a dark hood. "You're too late," the figure said, his voice cold and filled with contempt. Lena's eyes widened. "No," she whispered, her heart sinking as she recognized the figure before them. It was the man who had been chasing them from the beginning, the man who had orchestrated everything, the man who was part of the very society they had been trying to destroy. "You think you've won," the man sneered, "but you've just set everything into motion." Holmes's eyes narrowed as he stepped in front of Lena, his body tense, ready for the final confrontation. "You're wrong. It ends here." But the man smiled, the sound of his laughter echoing through the chamber like a cold wind. "No," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "This is only the beginning." And in that moment, Holmes realized that the real battle was just beginning. The storm that had raged outside was nothing compared to the storm that was about to unfold. Chapter 17. The Truth Unveiled. The chamber shook once more, the ancient stone walls vibrating with an eerie hum as the figure in the hooded cloak stepped closer. Holmes felt a cold shiver run down his spine, but he stood his ground. The air felt thick, charged with an energy that hummed with centuries of hidden power. He could feel it now. The truth was within their reach, but the storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was about to break inside the temple. Lena stood behind him, her eyes wide with fear and disbelief, as the man in front of them revealed himself, his voice ringing out with a dangerous calm. "You think you've won?" The man sneered, his voice low and cold. "But the truth is, you've only played into our hands. You're too late." Holmes clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remain calm despite the growing pressure. He had seen many faces in his career, but this man, was different. There was an air of authority, of someone who had controlled everything from the shadows for far too long. "Who are you?" Holmes demanded, his voice steady but laced with tension. "What is this society? Why have you been hunting us?" The man's lips curled into a twisted smile as he finally removed his hood, revealing his face. A sharp-featured middle-aged man with cold, calculating eyes. Holmes' stomach tightened. He had seen this man before in the records, in the research his father had conducted, but he couldn't place the name. "You've heard of us, Holmes," the man said with a smirk, reading Holmes' expression, the order of the hidden hand. "We have shaped the world for centuries, pulling the strings behind every major event. Wars, revolutions, empires, everything. We were always there, working in the shadows." Holmes felt his blood run cold. "The order of the hidden hand," he murmured. "I should have known." Lena looked between them, still trying to grasp the enormity of what she was hearing. "But why my father? Why me?" The man turned his gaze to her, his eyes cold and calculating. "Your father was part of a long line of protectors, Miss Dubrovsky. He was one of the few who saw the truth and tried to stop us. But you..." He looked her over with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. "You were never meant to be part of this. But your curiosity, your bloodline, it brought you into the fold." Lena stepped forward, her voice firm despite the terror that lurked beneath. "No. I won't let you control me. Not now, not ever." The man's eyes narrowed, but the smile never left his face. "You don't have a choice." Holmes stepped in front of her, his eyes never leaving the man. "If you think we'll let you continue, you're gravely mistaken." His hand tightened around the key. "This ends now." For a moment, the man said nothing, and the tension in the room grew thick enough to suffocate them. Then, without warning, he reached into his coat, pulling out a small, ornate dagger. Its blade gleamed faintly in the dim light of the temple. "You think you can stop us?" the man hissed, stepping closer. "This key, this map, they were never meant to be destroyed. They are a part of something far greater. You can't just erase history, Holmes." Holmes's eyes flicked down to the key in his hand, then to the altar where the scroll still rested. The weight of their significance hung in the air like a ticking bomb. If they didn't act soon, the world might never be the same. "We have no intention of erasing history," Holmes said, his voice steady but resolute. "We intend to stop people like you from rewriting it." The man laughed, a low, mocking sound that echoed through the chamber. "You don't understand, do you? This is bigger than you, bigger than anyone. It's too late to stop it." As the man lunged forward, his dagger gleaming, Holmes's instincts kicked in. He dodged to the side just as the blade swung toward him, his heart pounding in his chest. He grabbed the man's arm, twisting it with all his remaining strength, but the man was faster. With a swift motion, he broke free and swiped at Holmes again. "Holmes!" Lena shouted, but there was little she could do. She could only watch as the struggle between them intensified. Holmes staggered back, narrowly avoiding another strike, his side screaming in pain from the earlier wound. His vision blurred, but his focus remained unshaken. He had to end this. "Lena!" he called, his voice hoarse but urgent. "The altar! Get the scrolls." Lena didn't hesitate. She dashed toward the altar, her hands shaking as she grabbed the scrolls and tried to make sense of them. Holmes had given her a task, and she knew it was the only way they could stop the man in front of them. "No!" the man snarled, his eyes filled with fury. "You think you can just walk away from this? You think I'll let you destroy everything we've built?" The man lunged at Holmes once more, but this time Holmes was ready. With a sharp twist, he disarmed the man, sending the dagger skidding across the floor. In one fluid motion, Holmes pinned the man to the ground, his knee pressing into his chest. "It's over," Holmes said, his voice cold and firm. "This ends here." The man's face twisted in defeat. "You can't stop the inevitable. The order will rise again. You've merely delayed the inevitable." Holmes stared down at him, his eyes hard. "Maybe," he said, his voice tinged with resolve. "But not today." He turned to Lena, who had managed to unravel the scrolls. Her face was pale, but her eyes were filled with determination. "What does it say?" Holmes asked, his voice quiet but urgent. Lena unrolled the first scroll, her hands trembling as she read the ancient text. "It's a prophecy," she said, her voice a mixture of awe and fear. "It's a record of everything, the rise and fall of the order, the power that's been hidden for centuries." Holmes leaned over, studying the scroll. His eyes narrowed as he took in the meaning, piecing together the fragments of the prophecy. "It's not about power," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "It's about control." The order's purpose was never to rule. It was to keep the world in balance. But they twisted it, corrupted it. Lena looked up, her eyes wide. "So, what do we do now?" Holmes's gaze shifted to the man, who was still lying on the ground, breathing heavily but defeated. "We end it. We make sure this never happens again." Holmes stepped forward, pulling the dagger from the floor. He raised it high, its sharp blade gleaming in the dim light of the chamber. The man's eyes widened. "You wouldn't..." Holmes's hand dropped the dagger onto the stone altar with a resounding thud. "No," he said, his voice low. "Not like this." He turned to Lena, his voice steady. "We destroy the maps, the scrolls, everything. We make sure this secret stays buried forever." Lena nodded, her heart still racing, but there was a sense of finality in her expression. "For good." Holmes smiled faintly, his gaze shifting back to the defeated man. "For good." And as the storm raged outside and the temple shook with the weight of centuries of secrets, Holmes knew that they had won. They had ended the game. The world might never know the truth, but it didn't matter. Some secrets were too dangerous to be uncovered. The storm outside began to subside, but in that moment, a new calm fell over them, and the world, just for a while, was at peace. Chapter 18. The Dawn of a New Day. The quiet that followed the storm was almost eerie in its stillness. Inside the temple, all that remained was the sound of their breathing, the air now heavy with the weight of their actions. Holmes stood at the altar, his fingers brushing the ancient scrolls one last time. The power they had uncovered, the secrets that had been buried for centuries, now lay scattered before him. The man who had once controlled the storm had been defeated, his ambitions reduced to dust. Lena, still clutching the box, stood beside him, her eyes scanning the temple, her thoughts running through the chaos of the past days. What had started as a simple mission to uncover a secret had turned into something far greater, a journey that had torn apart everything she had known. Her father's death, the pursuit of the map, the ancient society that had controlled so much of the world's history, all of it had led to this moment. But now that it was over, the silence that filled the temple seemed almost too much to bear. "Is it really over?" she asked softly, her voice filled with doubt. Holmes turned to face her, his eyes tired but resolute. "Yes, Lena. It's over. We've ended it. The order won't rise again. Not from what we've uncovered." She nodded slowly, but there was a lingering unease in her expression. "But what happens now? What do we do with all of this? The scrolls, the map. It feels wrong to just leave it here." Holmes glanced around the chamber. The secrets of centuries lay in ruins before them. The altar, the stone walls, the ancient symbols now fading into the past. "Some secrets are better left buried," he said quietly, the weight of his words sinking in. "We destroy everything, the map, the scrolls, the box. It's the only way to make sure nothing like this ever happens again." Lena felt a pang in her chest as she looked at the scrolls, at the power they represented. She could still hear the whispers of the man, the cold, calculating voice that had tried to control everything, to manipulate history. It wasn't just about power, it was about controlling the future, shaping the world in ways that could never be undone. But she understood now. The power wasn't meant for them, it wasn't meant for anyone. "How do we destroy it?" Lena asked, her hand still shaking slightly as she held the box. Holmes's eyes darkened with a new resolve. "We take everything back to the heart of the temple. There's a chamber below this one, where the power is locked away. We'll make sure it stays there. Forever." Lena took a deep breath, gathering herself. She had no more questions, no more hesitation. The choice had been made, and they would see it through to the end. The journey down to the heart of the temple was almost surreal. The air was thick with history, and every step they took seemed to echo with the weight of centuries of hidden power. They passed through narrow corridors, each one darker and more oppressive than the last. But Holmes moved forward with unwavering determination, the key to ending it all in his hand. At the base of the temple, they reached the final chamber. It was a vast space, circular in shape, with an enormous stone pedestal at its center. The walls were lined with even more ancient symbols, some of which seemed to shift and change as they moved closer. It was as though the chamber itself was alive, breathing with the energy of the secrets it held. Holmes approached the pedestal and placed the box down gently. He took one last look at the map, the scrolls, the history of the order, and everything that had brought them to this moment. His fingers brushed the stone as he prepared to seal it away for good. "This is it," he said quietly, his voice filled with resolve. "Once we do this, it stays buried. No one will ever find it again." Lena stood beside him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. But there was none. Holmes was certain, as always. They had come this far, and now there was no going back. She took a deep breath, stepping forward. "Do it." Holmes nodded. He stepped back from the pedestal and with a final movement pressed the key into a hidden slot in the stone. There was a deep rumble, a grinding of ancient stone against ancient stone, and then a flash of light so bright it nearly blinded them both. The walls of the chamber shifted, the stone moving as if it had a mind of its own, locking the secrets away once more. The light dimmed, the rumbling stopped, and everything became still. It was done. The key fell to the ground with a soft thud, its work complete. Holmes and Lena stood there in silence, the weight of what had just transpired settling over them. The power was gone. The secrets, the map, the order, all of it had been sealed away. The world would never know the truth, but perhaps that was for the best. Holmes turned to Lena, his face softened with a tired but genuine smile. "It's over." She nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I never thought I'd be free of it," she whispered. "But now I can finally let it go." Holmes reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're free, Lena." "We both are." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stood there in the heart of the temple, surrounded by the silence of the past. The storm outside had finally stopped, and the world was beginning to breathe again. As they made their way back up the stone staircase, leaving the temple behind them, Holmes felt something he hadn't expected. Peace. The chaos was over. The darkness that had followed them for so long had finally receded. "Where do we go from here?" Lena asked, her voice filled with the uncertainty, but also hope. Holmes turned to her, a glimmer of a smile on his lips. "Wherever we want," he said. "The world's wide open now." The road ahead would be long, and the scars of the past would never fully fade. But for the first time in a long time, they both knew they were free to choose their path. And as they stepped out into the clearing, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm golden light over the world around them. For the first time, the storm was finally over.